You're with Truth News. It's Wednesday, the 29th of July, 2009. I'm Hereward Fenton, your host, and tonight we are presenting a special. We're going to devote the entire show to a very important question, a very important issue. Although some of our listeners may question that. They may say it's not a worthwhile subject to be focusing a show on. I disagree. I think it is important. And I'm not taking sides here. I'm not saying that I know the answer. I'm not saying it is one way or the other. But the question itself is important. And it doesn't tend to get a fair shake in the mainstream news. And of course, from the intro music there, you can probably guess what we're talking about. It's the Apollo moon landings. Being the anniversary of the Apollo moon landings last week, there has been a fair amount of news about the event being the 40th anniversary, and also the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter sending back its first images from the moon. Now, where I come in on this is I've really hadn't done much investigation of the Apollo moon hoax claims. I was interested in the subject after I heard the reports of the NASA images coming back. I went and had a look, and all I could see were these blurry white, images that are a few pixels, and they were talking on the news with a whole lot of ballyhoo on the news that this was like amazing imagery, and that always, when I see stuff on the news or hear stuff on the news that doesn't match what the actual information is, it always gets me questioning. So, I've watched a few of these documentaries now, and in the course of my research, I came in touch with an Australian man by the name of Jarrah White. And I got in touch with Jarrah, and I've now got him on the show tonight. Jarrah has produced an amazing set of YouTube videos, which are very detailed, and they cover a lot of aspects of the moon landings. There's photographic analysis, there's analysis of some questions of physics, questions of rocket engines, and what they can and can't do. So I'd like to welcome Jarrah to the show. Jarrah, welcome.
It's a pleasure being here.
Well, it's a great pleasure having you. Now, look, I'd like to give you a chance to really expound your views, without being interrupted. But just before I do that, I want to give you my take on this whole thing from a gut level, okay? Mm-hmm. Because I have certain issues and certain questions about the Apollo moon landings, which are kind of, they don't depend on whether the photographic analysis is correct, or whether the evidence about the crater is correct, or whether the evidence about the image of the moon in the porthole was real or not. I've got really basic questions, and I'll just run them past you and for our audience's benefit. Firstly, we had from 1967 through to 1972. From 1967 through to 1972, we had a series of missions which were labelled the Apollo missions. Now, in that time, so it said, we went to the moon, the Americans went to the moon 6 times. An amazing, incredible achievement, okay? And 6 times is a lot of times, To do it 6 times, you get pretty good at it, and you improve, and you refine, and if you've done it 6 times, really, you should be able to continue doing it indefinitely, because you've already solved all the major technical problems. However, they never did it again, and no country has ever done it again. This really puzzles me. This bothers me, okay? Another thing that really bothers me is the fact that there is no independent verification. There is no photograph that's ever been taken from any telescope, from the Hubble or from an Earth-based telescope or from any of the orbiters that have been to the moon, that shows the Apollo landing sites. And apart from these images which were trumpeted, that don't show you anything. Okay, this troubles me. It also troubles me that the Soviets never attempted to replicate what the Americans had done, considering the incredible propaganda value it would have had for them. And just to round that off, I just want to run through a few key events that were occurring in the world during the period of the Apollo missions. Okay, January 27, 1967, the first Apollo mission was destroyed by fire during a test and training exercise, and the commander of that mission and the other two were killed in the fire. In December 31, 1967, US forces in Vietnam reached nearly 500,000 troops. That was the maximum period of American involvement in the Vietnam War. The US deaths in the Vietnam War in that year were 11,000, and in the following year they were about the same. For the next few years, we had various events such as America was plunged into social chaos. We had Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4, 1968. The My Lai massacre, massive, loss of propaganda value for the United States. Hundreds of Vietnamese were killed by US soldiers in March of 1968. In April 1968, Apollo 6 was launched. On June 5 of 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. And during this time when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated, there were riots right across America. There were student protests. Hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets. There was a civil rights movement. There was the Black Power movement. There was an absolutely massive attempt to control the social unrest that was going on. But while all that was happening, the Apollo missions were just chugging along. We had July 1969, Apollo 11 successfully reached the moon. US deaths for that year in Vietnam reached 11,000. Then we had, in that same year, we had student protesters shot by the police and what do they call it? The American military. The National Guard fired live rounds at students. Then the American presence in Vietnam started to drop off. We had more Apollo missions, and by 1972, the American presence in Vietnam had dropped down to 133,000. They were already in the withdrawal phase. Then really the Apollo missions ended there. That was the end of it. Okay? Never repeated, never done again. Now, I just thought that information is interesting. It doesn't prove anything, but it certainly says something to me. The Americans had a whole lot to gain from the propaganda value of these missions. And
it helped as a distraction tactic from the wars in Vietnam, and also as a what's the word I'm looking for? A strategical bluff in the arms race with the Soviets. Certainly served that purpose.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, the propaganda value was just amazing because it really did. It magnetized a whole generation, and, I was part of that generation as a kid who looked up to these astronauts as father figures, and it gave people something to hope for, something to live for. It was incredibly powerful. And, all I can say is, I'll hand it over to you now, but all I can say is that if this story turns out to be fake, it's a total betrayal of a generation, and there's going to be hell to pay. So I actually don't want it to be fake. I want it to be real, okay? But I'm going to hand it over to you now, and, I'd just like you to maybe give us a background for how you got involved in this, and if you could actually give us your most concise, just think of boiling it down to bullet points for the audience to give the most concise and succinct view of why you think that the official understanding of this is completely wrong.
Okay, well, I wasn't around during the time of the moon landings. I was born in the 80s, but I did look up to the astronauts as heroes, as icons. As a kid, I wanted to be the first man on Mars, and I spent my life studying astronomy. Later on, I hear about the Apollo moon landing hoax theory, and I think, well, could this be real? Could this be a fake? And so I started doing my own investigation on it. I became friends with Ralph Renee, the author of NASA Mooned America, shortly afterwards. I did my own investigation. I looked to all the pros and cons of the theory, and I quickly came to the conclusion that yes, this was all faked. The probably there actually are three most major compelling points that I can address to. Number one is radiation in space. In the beginning, when James Van Allen, he was the discoverer of the Van Allen radiation belts, these fields of radiation that surround the Earth. In the early 1950s, he was sending up rockoons, which is like a rocket with a weather balloon attached. The weather balloon goes up, and the rocket fires the rest of the way up into space. He'd have these Geiger counters inside them. Right? They'd always detect enormously high levels of radiation. Later on, he would do the same thing with satellites, like he put the Geiger counters in Explorer, in the Pioneer, in all these different spacecraft, all these different space probes and space satellites. All right, so every time they go up into the Van Allen radiation belts, which begin at about 1,000 kilometers above, these radiation levels would suddenly rapidly start to literally go through the roof, and then they just clunk back down to zero because there was just simply too much radiation for these instruments to cope with, and so they became jammed. All right, he sent one satellite up after another, and they all did the same thing. So then eventually he decided to start shielding his Geiger counters with lead. He put a millimeter of lead around the Geiger counters, and so they could continue to count. But even with the lead shield, the readings still turned out to be 10 to 100 rem per hour. Now we use rem to measure how much radiation a person receives. You see, now you need a 500 rem to kill a person. Right now, with the lead shield around the Geiger counters, the readings were 10 to 100 rem per hour. Even 100 rem is going to give you some radiation symptoms, all right? Okay. And without this lead shield, the readings were anywhere from 312.5 rem per hour to 11,666 rem per hour. Now, I got that figure from E. Kovalev, who was the Soviet Union's radiation health officer. He had an article called Radiation Protection During Spaceflight. That was in the December 1983 Journal of Aviation, Space and Environmental Medicine.
Okay.
Now, Van Allen, he had his own articles, one in Scientific American, March 1959, another one in Space World, December 1961. He clearly stated that a human being cannot survive this level of radiation, and that adequately shielding astronauts within that given time frame, in the 60s, was beyond engineering capabilities. In fact, we can't even shield astronauts today from this type of radiation.
Could you just recap for a second what the actual range of those belts is in terms of like altitude above the Earth? Because that's kind of an important question that some people seem to be, they have different opinions on. So, like, when do they start and when do they end, and at what level are they at different?
All right. Well, the inner belt begins at 1,000 kilometers above the Earth, and the outer belt ends at 25,000 kilometers above the Earth.
Okay. So 25,000 kilometers. So that's
where it ends.
Right. And the space shuttle and all manned missions apart from Apollo, what is their maximum altitude that they've reached? Well,
it's mostly about a few hundred kilometers. It doesn't go into the Van Allen radiation belts. It stays well below that.
Okay.
There is a region that dips called the South Atlantic Anomaly. It's not as bad as the rest of the radiation belt, but satellites that go through it must have their instruments shut off before entering it, because to protect them from the radiation, basically.
Okay.
And in fact, to adequately shield the astronauts, right, you need 2 meters of water shielding. A guy called John H. Malden, he was an astrophysicist for NASA. He wrote a book called Prospects for Interstellar Travel. Now, in his book, he proposed 2 meters of water shielding surrounding the entire spacecraft, right? And he states that with this shielding around the spacecraft, the radiation within the Van Allen belt would be 1 rem per day, which is 0.041 rem per hour. So that's great, but obviously you're not going to have a powerful enough rocket to lift that shielding into space.
Can I just ask, how long, according to the trajectory of the spacecraft, how long were they in this zone? If they went to the moon?
When you're in the Van Allen belts, basically what the plan is, right? When you go into space, you're going 17,000 miles per hour. You speed up to 25,000 miles per hour, and that flings you out of Earth orbit and towards the moon. Now, even at that speed, you'll spend an hour going through the radiation belts on the way to the moon, and another hour on the way back.
Okay, so an hour each way. So
an hour each way.
Okay, and an hour's exposure is enough to cause serious physiological effects. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact,